Okay, thank you, folks. So I'm going to talk about ocean circulation model solution visualization. And this is part of an NSF-funded project in cyber infrastructure called the Poseidon Project. And there's a big team of people who've contributed to this. I'm going to try and mention the names as I go. And I'm aware that most of you don't know much about ocean circulation. So let me tell you a little about that to begin with. First of all, what are ocean circulation models? Well, actually, they're quite similar to the types of model that Charles Mennever was talking about this morning. And you can see on the right-hand side, a circulation model solution, which shows the sea level. And you can see it's between about -1 and about 1 meters, and the sea level varies from place to place and time to time, and it also increases with global warming. And this is a circulation model solution that spans the period 1992 to 2017. And it's crudely speaking, our best estimate of what we think the real ocean was doing during that period. And it solves the equations in the box on the left, which are the equations that Charles showed. There are a couple of minor differences because we have to take care of the seawater temperature, which is theta, and the salinity S as well. Separately, they both contribute to the density, which is rho. But otherwise, it's just rotating stratified fluid dynamics. Now, this particular example I'm showing you is called ECHO, or LLC 90. I've told you it's global. I've told you the period it spans. And the variables that we pull out of this are written there. We have the 3-dimensional vector velocity, so U, V, and W, the pressure, so the surface pressure is the animation, the temperature, and the salinity. And for this particular solution, you have about 1 degree horizontal resolution. So there's 360 degrees in longitude, there's 180 degrees in latitude, it has 50 depth levels, 312 months in that period. That's a data volume of about 150 gigabytes. So this is small, but 99%, maybe 99.5% of the data that's gone into this solution has been thrown away because this is what's called a state estimate. And so this is a solution that is constrained by observations. And that constraining process, the least squares process, means that the computational expense of running the optimization is about 200 times the expense of just running the free model. Okay, and all of that is thrown away. That's one example. Let me show you another one. So this is the same circulation model. It's called the MIT GCM, but now run in a different configuration. And if you're eagle-eyed, you will recognize that is the coast of Southern Africa. You can see on the bottom left-hand corner, the Cape Peninsula, Cape Town. And so this is the sea surface height, it's the surface pressure field, the same thing I was just showing you before, but now much, much greater resolution. And so this doesn't have 1 degree horizontal resolution, it has about 1/60th of a degree. And it's run for a shorter period, like about 15 months. The same field variables, the equations are the same. And now you can look at the size of an individual field, it's vastly bigger. And if you look at the entire data set for this particular solution, you're looking at about nearly 4 petabytes. So it rapidly gets large. Now, let me show some other examples of how people visualize solutions from these models. Okay, so you've already looked at a couple of examples. Let me show you a couple more. The first one, I think, is fabulous in many respects. This is just on an open website. In fact, if you go to that link, you can do this in real time. It's called Earthschool.net, and it allows you to explore various different aspects of the global environment, including the atmosphere, atmospheric chemistry, and the ocean. And so if I go back and replay it, it starts off showing the atmospheric circulation and the colors beneath the sea surface temperature. I then switch to animate the ocean currents. You can zoom in. It's highly interactive. So this was just like a 60-second screen capture yesterday. You can see the Gulf Stream and the Gulf Stream eddies, and then I switched to, it's called SST anomalies. So now you look at the perturbations in the SST field. Okay, so this has some particular merits. It's very interactive and performant. Okay, it's really easy to explore. It's free, and what I mean by that is for you to start interacting with the data, it takes of order seconds, okay, maybe 10 seconds. You don't have to, it's not behind a paywall, you don't have to log in or anything like that. It's up to date, robust, and persistent. Like I've never known this to go down. I use it in teaching all the time. But it has some specific disadvantages too. The first is that the fields are static. So even though you see the animations of the currents, the velocity field which is being visualized is fixed. So you see Lagrangian trajectories flowing through the Gulf Stream, but the Gulf Stream is fixed, okay, for 2 days ago. It's up to date. In other words, it's the estimate of the Gulf Stream from 2 days ago. It's at the surface, so you can only see sea surface temperature. You can't see anything beneath the sea surface. And it's also superficial in the sense that scientifically it's superficial because you can't get under the hood. You can't go any further than just look at this and tinker. Okay, so if you want to do some more detailed analysis, this tool won't work for you. Okay, so here's another example. This is from a paper that I wrote 10 years ago, and it's showing an animation of solutions from the MIT GCM between Greenland and Iceland. And this is one of my favorite currents. It's called the Denmark Strait Overflow. You can see there's a topographic gap. There's a saddle point in the underwater mountains, and there's deep, dense water that floods through this. It's the biggest waterfall that you've never heard of. It's the biggest waterfall in the world. And if I go back and restart the animation, you start by looking at sea surface height, the sea level, and then what happens is that goes transparent. And now what you're looking at with that color that I couldn't identify is a density surface. So this is the dense water, and you can see it glugging through this gap. And this is very important for the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the ocean's role in climate. We think it's changing. The rotating stratified fluid dynamics of this are uncertain and mysterious, but very interesting. So this is an animation from a paper that I wrote. It has certain advantages. It's very revealing of the flow through this gap, at least it was for me. It's archival in the sense that this is a professional peer-reviewed publication. It's there forever. You know, it's a YouTube video. But it has some disadvantages too. It's non-interactive, so you just play it. It was expensive to compute. So I had to download the data to my local machine. I had to develop the software, you know, to do all of the visualization and adjustment of the camera angle and so on. And then actually to render it took a long time. Okay, so here's another example from my group. Atusa Sabir is a graduate student who's just finishing her PhD. It's the same oceanographic region. On the right-hand side, what you're looking at is Lagrangian trajectories. So think of these as particles floating in the water. So this is one of the common ways in which you visualize the circulation. And they're colored by their source, their origin. Okay, so now they're moving through the Denmark Strait Overflow. I'll play it for you again. So the blue ones come from the north, the red and the orange ones come from south of Iceland. Okay, and then magically they all converge at this heavy black line, which is that topographic gap, the saddle point in the Denmark Strait, about now, and then they move forward in the flow. Okay, so this is also very revealing of the circulation. And on the left-hand side is a corollary diagram that shows the temperature and the salinity along those trajectories. Okay, so imagine that you're moving through the flow with one of these particles. The temperature and salinity is interpolated onto the trajectory of that ensemble of particles. And then you plot the ensemble mean of temperature and salinity over time, and you get this theta S diagram. And this is a classic way that oceanographers analyze data from observations of the real ocean, like from ships. So I won't explain what's going on, but you can see that initially the temperature and salinity properties of this water are different, and then they converge as they mix through the Denmark Strait Overflow. Okay, so there are some advantages of this mode of visualization too. It's very revealing, it's archival, it's multivariate in the sense that simultaneously you're looking at the circulation. So that's a three-dimensional vector velocity field, the temperature and the salinity along tracks through the circulation. It has some disadvantages as well. It's non-interactive. This is a really expensive calculation to make. And to do the software development, to build the code to do the Lagrangian tracking was also expensive. I mean, you're talking about months of graduate students' time to do the software development. Again, we downloaded the data and we did it locally on our own machines, which is not ideal. Okay, so now let me step back a little bit and talk briefly about what types of analysis we do with ocean circulation models. Perhaps these are prototypical for other science use cases. So there are examples of the first two that I've already shown you. The first is multivariate field visualization. So you simply want to look at the solution. Okay, so there's 5 fields in 4 dimensions. So you look at the temperature and the salinity, the velocity field, and so on. And maybe you look at things together. Okay, so your velocity field and the temperature and salinity simultaneously. So the first paper that I showed you is an example of that. That's about geophysical state. Simply characterizing, visualizing the geophysical state is like the what question. The next one, B, is about feature identification and tracking. So the second example is a good one for that because it tracked a particular water mass that we're interested in for various reasons, using these Lagrangian particles. And that requires some more detailed analysis. You can't simply take the solution from the circulation model and make those figures. You have to do further analysis to do the feature identification and tracking. The third one, pattern discovery and characterization, in some ways is a merger of the first two, because these fields, the velocity field, temperature, salinity, pressure, have very profound, complex, and somewhat uncertain space-time correlation structures. So the glugging of the water through the Denmark Strait is an example of that. It's quasi-periodic. There's lots of uncertainty. One is never quite like any other, but nevertheless, there really is a regular glugging. Okay, so that's an example of space-time correlation. And we want to discover those. We want to characterize them. So that's another example of characterizing the geophysical state of the system. And that leads you towards understanding the processes involved. And then the final was uncertainty exploration. So for example, if we want to understand how the ocean is changing in the future, we would need to quantify our confidence in knowledge of the state right now. And then that would be one source of uncertainty. And then moving forward into the future, what are the other things that might affect the evolution of the ocean state? That would be another source of uncertainty. Okay, so now let me tell you about the visualization software that we're doing in the Poseidon projects and start by trying to identify some design principles. And I hope, again, that these are somewhat generic and maybe useful in other science use cases. So the first is that we're interested in platform agnostic visualization tools that must be open, scalable, and cloud ready. So the cloud ready stuff is the ARCO that Alex mentioned earlier. In other words, analysis ready, cloud optimized data. Platform agnostic means that we do not want to commit to any particular provider. We don't want to commit to SciServer or Azure or AWS. We don't want to get locked in. Open, okay, so it's open source, it's open code development, but it's open in another sense as well. It's open access, like democratizing the data, the kind of thing Charles was talking about. It's also an equity issue because we want people to be able to access this data from anywhere. They simply need a browser and an internet connection. And it should be scalable, okay? If it's not scalable, it will only live for a year or 2 or 3. And most of the visualization technologies in this space are dead. You can find references to them, but you can't find them on the internet anymore. Okay, so the second design principle is it's a soup to nuts workflow with separate components. So what do I mean by that? You start with a very low barrier to entry, which is an interactive exploration of the data. And you end with a production journal-ready figure or table of numbers or animation. Okay, and you can move seamlessly between those two limits. And that demands that we have separate components. Like the interactive component is not going to be the same thing as doing the heavy lifting on the final end to do the production calculations. Okay, and then that's the data carpentry and the software carpentry that we heard about earlier as well. We want there to be a very low threshold to entry. So the null school net thing had like seconds as the latency for you to start interacting with the data. I think that's too ambitious, but I want that to be minutes or maybe 10 minutes so that you get a SciServer account and you can reproduce our results within minutes or maybe 10 minutes. That allows people to engage with the data and the tools who aren't professionals. So we want people who, the citizen science crowdsourcing type interactions. it also means that we design our tools so that we analyze the ocean circulation in a intuitive, convenient way. And what I mean by that specifically is that we present the circulation model solutions in a way that is familiar to oceanographers who go out and sample the real ocean. And I'll show you specific examples of that. But that's a deliberate choice. There are other options, but I think it also lowers the threshold to entry. You do not need to understand about ocean circulation models to get going. It has to be connected to a fully functional programming environment. Like, it has to be a backend that is going to be in MATLAB or Python or Julia or R, and with significant compute. And the final thing is that we must focus on the final computation and render. So that means that you do data proximate analysis. So that's the cloud-ready piece. The calculations are done close to the data in the cloud. And the rendering is the key thing. So you work backwards from the final picture, or the final number, to figure out how you're going to do the calculation. Okay, so there are two principal components I want to show you quickly. The first is called the Poseidon Viewer. So again, this is just a little animation of interaction. It's on the Sci server. This is a viewer for the LLC 4320 data set. So this is the 3.8 petabyte data set in real time. So I zoom down to South Africa. You're looking at salinity right now. Currently, you can look at salinity or temperature or sea surface height, the one I already showed you. You can select the various different color bars and data limits and so on. You can step through the data. So I show a couple of time steps here. So it's a 10-hour time step. You can see the eddies. This is the Antarctic circumpolar current. You can see them moving along. This model also has tides in it. So if you want to look at the tides, which aren't present in the deep ocean, then you need this kind of fine timescale resolution. Now you can zoom in. So now I'm going down to nearly 4,000 meters depth. Those two islands are Crozet and Kerguelen in the Southwest Indian Ocean. And there is a gap called the Crozet-Kerguelen Gap, which is that gap between the dark blue is the bathymetry, the underwater mountains. And now I've switched to temperature and I'm adjusting the limits. It takes a moment to plot. So now you're taking a completely different slice of this big data set. And again, you can time step through it. So there's deep flow from the Antarctic through this gap into the Indian Ocean, which is part of the global overturning circulation. Okay, then the final thing that gets demonstrated here is that you can now select a region of interest. So you do interactive data exploration on this 3.8 petabyte data set, select your region of interest, save it, and then transition to the second tool, which is this thing called Ocean Spy Analysis. So this is also on Sci server, and I'm just going to briefly show you a notebook. So that data that you've selected from the viewer gets imported into the notebook. And now you're accessing that 3.8 petabyte data set in a programming environment. Everything is done lazily. It's lazy computation. So you only ever do any calculations or read any data when you know what you want to compute at the very end. So this particular version of the data set was 84 terabytes. It takes 3 or 4 seconds to open that. You cut out an image here of the surface temperature around Iceland. Now we're doing a calculation on the data. This is computing the curl, so that's the vorticity. It takes a few seconds, like 8 seconds. Now we're making an oceanographic section between Greenland and Scotland. And again, it just takes a few seconds. And this is an oceanographic section you can compare to observations the way that an observer from a ship would make measurements. Okay, so let me just wrap up. Where are we going next? This is the incremental piece where we're going to add more fields to the viewer. We're going to expand the viewer to cover different data sets. It's not very performant right now. We're going to enrich the interaction both directions from the viewer to the Ocean Spy notebook and backwards. We want to disseminate it diversely, which I think is really important. Diagnose user patterns. I can think of other things. But here is the moonshot idea, which Alex asked us to talk about. So those types of analysis and those design principles, I think, are more broadly applicable than to just ocean general circulations. And in this space, the big elephant in the room is coupled climate models as part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the latest version of that is called AR6. There was a 4,000-page report published 6 months ago. And there are dozens of coupled climate models that contributed to AR6. And you can see they're called global scale coupled climate models or Earth system models. You can see the diversity of different elements. Ocean circulation models is one of about a dozen elements in these coupled climate models. Now, AR6, we don't know how much data is going to be involved in AR6. We can tell you about AR5, and these two figures here are from a German climate center that serves AR5 data. And on the left one, it shows the total number of data sets and then the total volume of the data. So for AR5, there's 1 million individual files, and you're talking about nearly 2 petabytes of data. And when it went from AR4 to AR5, there was a 1,000 times increase in data volume. Okay, so if we extrapolate that, actually it's super exponential, because it was only 100 times increase from the TAR, which is the third assessment report, to AR4. We're going to be at exabyte scales for AR6. Okay, the one on the right shows the way they do business right now, which is they download the data to the individual scientist. So currently, for the last 5 years, they're serving a petabyte a year download of AR5 data. But there is no way that they are going to serve an exabyte a year download to AR5 data. So these tools and these design principles, I think, can be applied to this space. And that's it. Thanks.